aya, nila kinuzawia, miamia, mayawate pake neola kakoke, nungi kakikwe. So I'm Wesley Leonard, member of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma, and I'm a linguist, or a linguistic anthropologist, and I work on the reclamation, as I call it, of indigenous languages. California is in fact a hotbed of indigenous languages. By indigenous I mean Native American, as in here before colonizers or before the other people arrived. And California perhaps is a hotbed of this because there are so many languages, upwards of 100 right here in California itself. And therefore California has more languages, indigenous languages, than any other state in the United States. Of course, the states were added later. These are modern political boundaries, and the languages existed and continue to exist, irrespective of those boundaries. But I actually came to California to work on my own language, which is Miami. I'm a citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. My tribe is historically from Ohio and Indiana and surrounding areas. And yet I'm here in California because there are a lot of efforts going on here, and I thought I could learn from those efforts. I came here to UC Berkeley to do my PhD in linguistics. I've since merged into other related fields, which is anthropology and Native American studies. And what I've come to see over a period of years is that there's really a lot going on. I also see that there are lots and lots of misconceptions about indigenous languages, so I wanted to mention a few of those. One, and a major one, is that indigenous languages are from the past and stayed there in the past. This is a real problem because, of course, here I am today, an indigenous person in 2010, and there are many, many others like me. We are people with a past, not people from the past, and likewise with our languages. They have contemporary relevance. Some have always been spoken, some, such as my own, such as the Miami language, or Miamia as we call it, had a period of dormancy, but then have since been brought back using written and audio documentation to relearn the language and to introduce it into the community. So one of the major misconceptions is that indigenous languages belong in the past. No, they come from the past, they exist in the present, and they will continue to exist in the future. Another major misconception is, of course, that these indigenous languages are all the same, or at least more similar than they actually are. What we find here in California alone, there are upwards of 100 different languages, and by language I mean varieties that are mutually unintelligible, where a speaker of one could not understand a speaker of another one. So we're not talking about related dialects, of which there are also many, but actual outright different languages. And for whatever reason, we native people tend to be lumped together. And it's true that in certain political senses that makes sense because we've all had certain common experiences in terms of the colonizers treating us all the same, sending us to boarding schools and things like that. And so a certain political sense has developed out of that. And yet we are all different. We speak different languages. But what I think is held in common among those languages, beyond the fact that they exist in the present and will exist in the future, is that they're very, very important to the people who claim them. Sometimes in my own work, and I've taught at a number of universities, usually public schools, so I teach a variety of students, and I speak on these issues in a variety of places. And one of the questions that I sometimes get is something to the effect of, well, if it's so hard to learn a language, especially a language that has gone out of use or perhaps it's only spoken fluently by a few people, usually elderly people, why do you go out of your way to learn it? Why do you go out of your way to devote your career to it? Why do you have workshops around California and elsewhere to learn these languages? Why do you have language camps? Why do you go to all of this trouble when in fact you're probably already managing on a daily basis just fine in English or perhaps in some other language that you might happen to speak? And of course, as I've said before, my degree is in linguistics, but I've sort of moved into anthropology, where sometimes I've started to question the questions themselves. And I think now that the better question isn't, why do you go out of your way to learn these languages? Why do you go out of your way to reclaim these languages? But rather, given that language learning is relatively difficult to do and it takes some resources and it takes time, what does it tell you that so many people are putting so much effort into doing it? And I think that that's the better question. This idea that we could somehow just put our languages aside, or that we wouldn't care about them, or that we would forget about them, really, I think, is misguided and doesn't recognize how important our nations, our indigenous nations and our cultures are to us. We can't put aside our languages any more than we could put aside anything else that's integral to our identity or to our culture. And so that's a major misconception there, this idea that somehow languages are not as important as they actually are. People care very deeply about their languages. Just look around the United States and various political movements that we have, usually in terms of English only or anti-bilingual education or other things that happen to be common right now. I know some people agree with those things, some people strongly disagree with those things, but regardless, one point that you can always take from them is that languages matter. People care very deeply about their languages. So that was one other misconception. A lot of times there are misconceptions about the languages themselves. For whatever reason, people find it straightforward that languages such as English would continue to evolve with the times, with new words entering English and with the language itself changing. However, and this actually happens in linguistics as well as a professional discipline, where sometimes people will put value judgments on the language and somehow assume that, or talk in a way as if the grammar and the vocabulary were frozen at some point in the past, usually in some sort of historical document, and that they're not going to continue to change, or if they do change, that they're somehow not legitimate. People use terms such as attrition to describe changes in indigenous languages that might, in the context of English, just be called change. A basic tenet of linguistic science is that languages can change. All languages are equal in their expressive potential. They're not equal in a literal sense, because if they were equal, they would all be exactly the same. And in fact, we have about 7,000 different languages in the world. And that's part of the beauty of languages, that they're not all the same. But they're all equal in their expressive potential, and they're all equal in the sense that they're governed by patterns, or have patterns that correspond to regular meanings. It's just that the patterns themselves might differ from one language to the next. But in terms of expressive potential, one of the things that means is that a language can add, or does add, to its vocabulary to reflect the needs of its users. So for example, in my language in Miami, our word for computer, which didn't exist historically, is kindelindakane, which means something like the thing that thinks fast, or an instrument for thinking fast. Achimwakane is telephone, and that means a thing for relating information, or in a conversational sense. And this is a basic process, but again, for whatever reason, people have this idea that indigenous languages in form were frozen in the past. And it goes right back to that idea that indigenous peoples are frozen in the past, or perhaps that we're at best descendants today rather than actual members of our respective communities, Miami in my case, and then of course likewise for various California groups. Actually reminded here, I'm looking around the Berkeley campus. It was 10 years ago that I first came here as a PhD student, and that first fall of 2000, there was an article in a local newspaper that was talking about a gathering of local indigenous peoples, Ohlone being kind of the cover term. Of course, there are various respective groups within that, but Ohlone was the term that was used in this article. And the article was actually quoting various people who are talking about how the Ohlone are still here, so using very much present tense. And it was reporting on a gathering that had happened a few days prior. And yet, the person writing the article kept referring to these Ohlone descendants. So one line would say, the Ohlone are still here, they're people of the present. And then the next line, well, these Ohlone descendants got together. And so on. Yeah, and this idea that we are frozen in the past, or that we're at best descendants of the real members of our nations, or that we don't really speak our languages. These ideas are very, very prominent. They're things that we all have to move beyond, because they keep us in our place. They keep us from flourishing. And unfortunately, for a lot of Native people, especially children, these are things that they're taught, either explicitly or in some cases implicitly, and that they come to believe themselves.
the Shoshone and the Paiute people were very closely connected. In fact, some of them have taken the language and have merged it to some context because they are so similar, and we're just so similar. And so it's interesting to note that, that similarity. As I traveled down to Southern California, it was very exciting for me to hear our language spoke by the Indian people down in Morongo. And I'm already fascinated by the fact I started to study the history of the Tongva. And it's really interesting, and it always happens historically. The white man has a different ear for the sounds of languages. And my mother, who's an elder who is very well knowledged in culture, language, and is utilized for cultural preservation, was talking with me, and she was telling me that maybe the traditional name of the Tongva was Songva, which means those who live around lots of water, Songva. And you can imagine if an elder man would say Songva, his voice might change, Songva, it might have sounded like Dongva. But the Va, we know, we all share that, that's water.
So I've been working on revitalizing my ancestral language, which is called Chochenyo. Chochenyo is one of the 8 different Ohlone languages that have historically been spoken from about Vallejo all the way down to Monterey in our traditional homeland. And today 3 of the Ohlone languages are being revitalized. So Chochenyo, which is my language, Mutsun Ohlone, which is from the Gilroy area, and Rumsian Ohlone, which is from the Monterey area. And fortunately, with our language, it was documented before the last fluent speakers of the language passed away in the 1930s. So using all of that documentation that they preserved of vocabulary, sentence structure, family stories, old songs, we're able to revitalize the language and speak it in the 21st century. And for me, it's very special because I didn't grow up speaking the language, but now I can have a conversation with my family. Now I can pray in my language. Now I can go about daily things in my life speaking the language, which a few years ago I wasn't able to do. And so peering into the language of our ancestors, it gives us a lot of insight to how they lived, how they saw themselves. And for me, being able to speak the language, it speaks testaments to the intelligence of people thousands of years ago. Like, there's so many concepts in the language that don't have direct translations into English, which even for me, sometimes I have to kind of nudge myself to think outside of this English framework that I was raised with. And so it's also been powerful for me to push myself further to understand these concepts. So it's special, and it's fortunate that the language was preserved. It's fortunate it's being brought back. My little brother, he's 9 years old, and when I walk in the house now, he greets me in Chochenyo. He asks me how I'm doing in Chochenyo. We have conversations in the language, and I know in the future, when I have kids, my kids will also speak the language. So it's nice that it was preserved so that it's not lost and that it will be saved and our next generations will be fluent in it.